Looking at the conquest of the Promised Land in the Old Testament, we now bring it forward into the New Testament to see what that looks like. I mentioned a few things in the previous verse, but I've since been studying on that subject and I'd like to expound a bit more on that topic. And we're going to base this on the verse found in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9. And it reads, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God." This verse is part of a broader passage about entering God's rest using the concept of the Promised Land and Sabbath rest as metaphors for the inheritance believers have in Christ. It emphasizes that God's promise of rest and inheritance is still available for those who have faith and obedience. So let's go deeper into this topic. So I'm just going to read some of the thoughts I was journaling as I was studying these passages again. So the concept of the Promised Land in relation to Hebrew 4:9 is deeply significant because it connects the historic narrative of Israel entering Canaan with the spiritual rest that believers experience in Christ. Because we're saved unto freedom, but we're also saved unto rest. The Sabbath rest mentioned in this verse transcends the physical land of Canaan and points to a greater eternal rest that God has prepared for his people. The Promised Land was a tangible fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12, 1-7, and a physical place of rest for the Israelites after their exodus from Egypt. However, the author of Hebrews 4 explains that the Promised Land was not the ultimate rest God had in mind. Instead, it served as a symbol of a greater spiritual reality, and I think that was a foreshadowing of Christ. So when we look at key points about the Promised Land, we see that they were promised rest, specifically rest from their enemies, and then we see that they were also promised the presence of God. Canaan was supposed to be a place where Israel would live free from oppression, enjoying peace and prosperity. This is according to Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 9-10. And then when it comes to God's rest, the Promised Land symbolized a place where God's people would dwell with him in covenant relationship with his blessings and presence among them. But because the Israelites failed to obey God, they faced exile, division, all due to sin and rebellion. As such, the experience in Canaan was incomplete. So when we look at it historically, in Psalms, there's somewhere where God says that, "So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest." This is Psalm 95 when we're looking at the summary of the Exodus and the wilderness journey. And this is also quoted in Hebrew 3. The generation that left Egypt under Moses failed to enter the Promised Land due to unbelief. And this is according to Numbers chapter 14. Even after Joseph led the next generation into Canaan, the ultimate rest was still not fully realized. But then when we get to Hebrew 4, we find that here we have rest as a continued promise. This verse clarifies that the rest God promised was not confined to the physical land of Canaan. It reads, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God." This means that the rest described is spiritual and eternal, available to all who have come to trust in God. This recalls verses again such as, "Cast your burdens unto me, for I care for you." There's so many promises in the parables about rest for us, not to fret, not to worry, to take everything to God in prayer, in supplication, to not worry about what we'll eat or what we will drink or where we will sleep and all such things, because God has already provided for us. So there truly remains a rest for those that have entered into the promise. In fact, Hebrews 10:4 says specifically, "For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his." And so we see that the Sabbath rest is a reminder that salvation is not achieved by human effort, but it is a gift from God. Just as God rested after creation, this is in Genesis 2, believers rest in the finished work of Christ, ceasing from striving for righteousness through their own effort. Another promise we enjoy as believers is rest in God's presence. The Promised Land symbolized God's dwelling with his people, but in Christ, believers experience the fullness of God's presence. When we read John 14, it says, "We will come to them and make our home with them." The ultimate fulfillment of this presence will be in the new heaven and the new earth, where God will dwell with his people eternally. And this is in Revelations 21. And then a third type of rest we are promised is eternal rest. The Promised Land points to the eternal inheritance of believers. When you read 1 Peter 1, it says, "An inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you." This eternal rest includes freedom from sin, suffering, and death, fully realized in the presence of God. So what are the key takeaways from this? What are the keys that we need to actually be able to see this apply in our lives? Well, the first one is that faith is essential. Just as the Israelites failed to enter the Promised Land because of unbelief, believers are called to trust in God's promises to enter into his rest, according to Hebrews 4, 2 and 3. And then the second one is that rest is found in Christ. Jesus invited all who are weary to find rest in him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. This is Matthew 11:28. So the journey is not yet complete, because while believers experience that rest now, it will ultimately continue into eternity. When you read Hebrews 4:11, it says, "Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following the example of disobedience." And this is for those who would not believe in the salvation that was extended to them. The New Testament also has several other verses speaking about an inheritance. When we read Ephesians 1:8, it reads, "I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy place." So clearly we still have an inheritance here. We still have an inheritance in our time. What was done in the Old Testament was a foreshadowing of what would become for us in the New Testament. And as we rest in Christ himself, we rest in his finished work of the cross, and we rest in the assurance of an eternity with him. And then when you read Colossians 3:24, it reads, "Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward, it is the Lord Christ you are serving." So everything we do is in the service of Christ, because he died on the cross. And when we take the Holy Communion, what we're saying is that we died along with you, and now it is no longer I that lives, but Christ that lives through me. So everything we do as Christians is in the service to the Lord. And another verse is Psalms 37:29, which reads, "The righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it forever." Again, inheritance. We have such a rich inheritance in Christ that we shouldn't be fretting about anything. Now, does it mean that rest is the absence of warfare? Some believers would say that's the case, but I beg to differ, because I know that when you read the Pauline epistles, there you find out that we as Christians are called to a life of warfare. We have been given rest, but we must fight to enter that rest. So this is not contradictory as one would look at it, because the Bible confirms itself when you read through the verses, and that's the only way you have a complete picture. If you take one verse out of context, this is how you end up walking around saying there is no such thing as spiritual warfare, even while the enemy is pounding at your home and taking away all the inheritance that you're supposed to be resting in. So we have to take the Bible in its entirety. We have to look at verses and cross-reference so we can have a fuller picture of that which is expected from us as believers. But in conclusion, the promised land and the Sabbath rest in Hebrew 4:9 are interconnected. The promised land was a foreshadowing of a deeper eternal rest that is now available through faith in Christ. This rest involves ceasing from self-reliance, dwelling in God's presence, and anticipating the eternal inheritance he has prepared for his people. Understanding this verse challenges believers to trust in God's promises, rest in his finished work, and look forward to the eternal fulfillment of his kingdom. So I'm going to leave this here, and goodbye.